Good morning, Richard. Sorry for that. We have a technical issue here, but I'll do as best I can. My presentation, I'm afraid, is going to be without PowerPoint, that some people might find as a relief. But I'll shoot through the things I wanted to say anyway, and the presentation will be online later. So good morning, everybody. You probably gathered from my intro that I'm now characterized by who I used to be rather than who I am now. But I thought I'd look backwards a bit at where we've come. And it's almost exactly 10 years since I announced the government mandate in 2010 at a conference organized by Autodesk, and we're hearing from Phil Bernstein later. But that conference was not really about digital. It was about structural change in the industry. And it's worth looking at the context of that. I had been in government for a few months by then. But my first day at BIS, I attended a meeting, or chaired a meeting, attended by Peter Mandelson, in which he laid down the carbon challenge, to get carbon out of construction. And yet, the following year, of course, had a change of government. And the issue was not about carbon, it was about money. And I had some projections that you look at this presentation later, you'll see them, about the time it was going to take to repair our level of debt. And at that time in 2010, the answer was about 2030, we would get back to a level of borrowing formerly known as prudent. And of course, it's even worse now. And the graph, if I had to put a dot on where we are now in terms of our deficit, it's way off the top of that graph. So the situation in 2010 was there was not enough money and there was too much carbon in the industry. And we were in a time of crisis. And the only thing that's changed since, I guess, is particularly with COVID, things have got worse. So since then, we've had Judith Hackett's report, we heard about that yesterday, and the golden thread, which is absolutely key to BIM and carrying data through the project, of course. We have the crisis of COVID, and we have Brexit and the whole series of things. So the good news, I suppose, is that this is a good time for taking a crisis in hand again and using the moment. I'm not entirely convinced that COVID will change everything, because everybody I talk to wants to like to get back to normal. And of course, being able to speak on the Zoom is not quite the same thing as a digital industry. Very quickly, then what were the issues that we were challenging, and why BIM? Well, the first thing was a massive amount of fragmentation of the industry. And the BIS people that produced a diagram for me when I arrived about who the stakeholders of the construction were. And it was more complex than chemistry, and it's still an issue that you can't really find the industry to talk to. The next issue is our famous silos, and we've heard all of this over the last couple of days anyway, of consultants and contractors and users and so on, not talking to each other and working collaboratively together. We have this hierarchical system of appointing a god, architect or designer or engineer, and then the work filtering down to where the job is actually done, and those people being kind of separated from the industry, and we have a massive amount of vested interest. Above all, though, nobody owns the whole process. And as I said before, people actually do the work, make the stuff, product manufacturers, and do the stuff, trade contractors, tend not to be at the table when we're discussing big changes. So the simple issue of why we don't handle innovation well is because we can't, because nobody owns enough of the process to change it. B, because when we can, it's not often worth it. There's no point in having a better answer to a question you'll never get asked again. And the diverse nature of our demand means just that. And thirdly, there's no driving force for change in the way that other industries have confronted in the form of international competition, because you still can't quite import a building. So in one of my sort of frustrated days, I gave a talk called Integrate, You Bastards. Integration still is the answer. And until that happens, we meet every client with our fingers crossed behind our back. We're making promises that we probably can't keep. And if you look at the way buildings perform by comparison with how they're expected to perform, they're woefully short in terms of energy, accessibility for cleaning, and so on. So we're a mile away from a hard landing. And the extra skill we've learned is to decide who to point to and say, not me, it was him or her. So all of that's not new. I've heard it all before, but hear it all again. I had a speech from the minister yesterday that sounded desperately familiar to me. Here we go again. And with Egan and Andrew Wolstenholme's report and Latham before them, the reality is nonetheless that if you look at those reports and consolidate those things which are said to lie behind our problems, a huge number of them are around the communication of information. Not on time, not coordinated, not complete, and so on. And that causes problems all the way downstream. And then we start the fight, don't we, of, you get an opening bid and it's not what you really wanted in the first place, and round we go again. That's been a very good career for me, arguing about how much people should be paid. But none of my proudest moments when I lie on my deathbed will be about claims negotiations. They'll be about great buildings made. So the key things in there then are a move towards more standardization, a move towards offsite, you heard about that yesterday, less waste, but above all, wiser use of digital. So then we had to face some big decisions in 2009, 2010 when we put this together. First of all, what's it for? And the answer was for everything, all construction. Call it building if you will, infrastructure. People get upset when you do that, but nonetheless, it is all being built. Who's it for? Well, it's not for the market, for me anyway, it's not for the market leaders. They will be off and running on their own. They don't need any more help and so on. And you need your market leaders to drive the leading edge, to make sure that stuff works and so on. And frankly, at the back of the field, as it were, there'll be people who fall off as well. So for me, the whole audience was the middle of the mass of the market. So you hear lots of ideas, lots of presentations that are driven at the leading edge of this thing, and probably most people who are by nature on this conference are in that position. But really what we wanted to move, and what we still want to move, is the whole industry. So tuning in yesterday and to a conference last week, I just heard a blizzard of acronyms. Yeah, and I really thought, who's this for? And are we connecting with the audience that we need to connect with? We want to make wholesale change. And the reality of people who make their living in mud, we need to be brought back to that every now and again. In terms of guiding principles, first thing was, God bless Autodesk for organizing the conference, but no picking winners, no describing or defining a single system. That would be a huge mistake. It would kill innovation, and the government shouldn't do that anyway. But what we did want was a shared platform. Whoever you want can own the platform, but can we please get in so that we can have apps for this and apps for that and so on. So we wanted an app world. And who would have guessed, if you told your grandfather, or my grandfather, my generation, that the best-selling camera would be made by a phone manufacturer, they wouldn't have understood that. We wouldn't have guessed that. We wanted to leave complexity in the supply chain and make things absolutely as simple as they could be. And that remains a challenge. We can make massive models and so on. But just because you can doesn't mean you should. We don't sort of need the mad King Ludwig of Bavaria approach to design. And you should therefore only ask for what you want to ask for. A big principle, and one which I think we may have lost touch with, is it should be and feel in reach for the vast majority of that middle of the field. So we sat down and talked about interoperability, 10 years ago, and I talked about 20 years ago, and that holy grail and so on. But so a big decision then was, you can't wait for that. You have to move on. And Kobe, therefore, was a gift. It doesn't. Still, I would say, and we might have to do this over Q&A, not all information doesn't need to find all the rest of the information. What's important is things that need to find each other to do. So the Holy Grail, I think, can stay that. We need to move on. The principle that I applied then was Kennedy and the space rocket. When Kennedy said they put a man on the moon in the 60s, he already knew they could do it. So we were looking for things that we defined level 2 then as what we kind of know almost how to do now. The technology was there, the skills were there, and the instincts were there, particularly against the background of a recession. So one of my favorite sayings, G.K. Chesterton saying, was, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. Doesn't mean that you do it deliberately badly. It's another way of saying that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Just get on with something. So when we look today, I think the issue still is what's in reach for the next level, and I'll come on to that. Next, what's government's job? We have a terrible habit from COVID to everything else in our lives to say government must fix it. It was a guiding principle of mine in going into government that you can't reach into an industry under the bonnet and fix it. You need to have the push-pull, which Mark Farmer referred to yesterday. But government does have some levers. It has regulation, but of course in 2010 we had a government that didn't believe in regulation and was even looking at abolishing building regulations altogether. It has fiscal policy, but it didn't have any money. But it has its own program. So the obvious thing to do was to create an incentive by the use of the government, our biggest client, public sector client. So government's job, I think, was to say, on our own program, this is what we want to do, but also in parallel with that, to organize conversations with the industry in a coordinated way. And I still think there's a need for that. I'd like to see the CLC step up and say, we're not having every conversation, but this is the conversation we're listening to. And I know that a group started a conversation about blockchain. I don't know where it went, but I think the CLC should say that's where we expect the progress to be made. Next, we've looked at, what the first step should be. A terrifying business. I used to use an image of, how you learn to ski jump. What are the first steps and so on. So that was about standards and methodologies and a common understanding, and a diagram you've seen 1,000 times of, what the steps through the various levels would be from 2D CAD through to a fully collaborative digital world. And that was about standards. And again, we heard from Anne yesterday about how much progress had been made on those. And the guiding principle there was, what's the balance? The question that we asked, for example, the industry and the software houses is, what's the least we have to do to encourage convergence without killing innovation by setting standards too tight? So for all the criticism that one might make of how this industry works, and by the way, we all do that, but don't we all love it? We wouldn't want to be anywhere else, would we? If I look back and say, so what do you think of it so far? I actually think it's amazing. How much progress has been made. And did we think that every government department would handle every job in BIM in 6 years? Not really. But what we thought we could start was something that couldn't be stopped. And I think in that sense, it is amazing where we've got to in 10 years in embedding new standards and in creating a body of people who want to go this way. And my objective really was just to make it unstoppable. Once you can see the benefits of working in this way, why would you do it in any other way? And I tended to refuse to discuss what the maximum size or minimum size of project was that was appropriate for BIM, because in the end, the whole industry will be working this way, and surely. Looking ahead then and picking up some of those principles, as I said, when you look at the things that we think are wrong with the industry, there are two things you have to recognize. One is that anything that you do to improve it should address those particular issues. But there also needs to be a realism about how many things you can change, how quickly. And as I say, you need to follow the Kennedy principle of can we have a rocket, please? So looking ahead and thinking, okay, so what now? We now move from level 2 to level 3. And what we want from that, and what has to happen so that does happen. The fundamental thing about the difference in that level to me is that we have to go from a dumb to a parametric model to one that has data in it. And this is a job for everybody, and it's sort of stalled because I think people are thinking, where's the data? And the answer is, if you don't start collecting it, it won't be available. And if it's not available, you won't start using it. So I think everybody needs to start looking at the data that can be created in their own world and that's required in their own world, and start to define a good set of standards around what the next level of a parametric plus data model would look like. So that's for everybody. We set up structures in 2010 to drive BIM forward. And we had BIM for rail and BIM for roads and so on. And I sort of slightly facetiously said, we need a BIM for light bulbs group. Everybody who makes anything in the industry or does anything in the industry needs to think about the extent to which they can play in a digital world, produce useful information to load with models and so on and so forth. Next, we need to go from the so-called lonely BIM to a more collaborative model. That's about the spreading of technology and the spreading of habit and so on. And COVID has shown us a little bit about both the potential and the limitations of working in a more collaborative way. And I hope we kind of seize on that and generalize it. We need to move from office to site, so that people are holding in their hands, that guy with his feet in the mud, holding in their hands the instruments of digital change and so on. And then we need to move up to whole systems and to look not just at buildings under construction, but assets in use. And this is fundamental. And to the reason for integrating soft landings in very early. was for just that reason. The golden thread to me is a thread that doesn't just keep a building safe and performing in accordance with design standards, but actually works through right through to the use of the asset, which after all is where the money is and where the value is. And we get very hung up about ways of judging value in tendering processes and so on. But whatever equation you do, almost all the money that counts is in the asset in use. And in the operation of the building and so on. And the image you'll see when you look at my presentation is, a proper photograph given me to be by Bill Eagle, whom some of you will know, of the maintenance manuals for a hospital, a great pile of boxes and so on. And the engineer being confronted with the fact that when something doesn't work, the answer's in there somewhere. So, how useless is that? And a good expression, I think, is that if it's not digital, it's lost, because sooner or later it will be, or you won't even know it exists. And I think then you work up to the whole idea of a digital built Britain. My problem with that is going back to the idea of it not being in reach. It really appeals to politicians. The idea of a nation's systems as a train set really appeals to politicians. And of course, it appeals to the leading edge of the marketplace as well. But I don't think it's in reach. And if I look at saw lots of good figures yesterday about the amount of change that people think is coming along. But there was a survey a few weeks ago that talked about 30% of businesses having a plan to go digital. So what on earth are the other 70% doing? So to conclude, are we really there yet? As the children say in the back of the car. Well, I think we know where there is. What I'm not sure is whether we know how to get from here to there. And the clever thing is not defining a much cleverer digital world, but rather knowing how we get from here to there. And I want to see a plan for that. Maybe because I'm not connected so well anymore, I don't see it. So if nothing else, it's a comms issue. We need to go back to those principles of can't design a space rocket, so can we see it? Can we reach it? If I was in a small business, would I think this was in reach? What are the small steps that get us there? And are we aware of the limitations of this technology? I had a picture which I need to describe to you, which was a headline this week about a drone being brought down by a seagull. And the picture I had to illustrate that was actually of an image of the way we could use drones to control seagulls. So whether the technology is in charge of us or we're in charge of the technology, we need to think about the accidents that can happen and the unintended consequences that might happen. And we need to deliver. We have some delivery mechanisms, networks, and above all, leadership. Who's going to make this happen, and who can show people and talk to people? And it won't be changed by arm waving, but there needs to be a bit more arm waving about why this game is worth playing for that middle of the pack. And my final comment, I think, is that the industry needs to take ownership. We do need government to stay engaged, more engaged than it is, I think, using its buying power and facilitating conversations and playing its part in the Construction Leadership Council, which I think is should be the key body here. It's faced up well to COVID. Let's see it face up to this much bigger, longer term challenge. So leadership, and the industry now, must take ownership of this and recognize that the change has to come from within, and we need to collaborate on this as much as we need to collaborate on a project. So that's me. It's my 20 minutes. Thank you, and I'll be back for the Q&A later. Richard, thanks.
Paul, thank you very much for that. It is a joy to see and hear you. Sorry we couldn't see your slides, but we will make sure that for everybody involved, they'll actually get to see a copy of those slides. And obviously, I've seen them. They are well worth seeing. There are some laugh out loud images in there that really do capture how the industry has been. And hearing that vision for where it was and seeing the progress we've made in those 10 years, as you say, is fantastic. We've already got some great questions coming in for you. So looking forward to exploring that when we get onto the panel a little bit later.
I'll see you later.
Thank you very much.
Okay.